Hello again. Today we're going to continue our peripheral nervous system and we're going to learn about the spinal nerves and reflexes. So you have 31 pair of spinal nerves and they're named based on the vertebra that they come out near. And so if you look at your spinal cord, you'll see that these spinal nerves are coming out and they're coming out in those intervertebral foramen, which are the little holes that are made by the vertebra being on top of each other. And C1 through C7, they come out in the intervertebral foramen above the vertebra that they're named for. So the C1 spinal nerve comes out above the C1 vertebra. And the same thing happens with C2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now, the C8 cervical nerve comes out below the C7 vertebra. The rest of your spinal nerves come out below the level of the vertebra that they're named for. So your T1 spinal nerve comes out below the T1, T2 comes out below the T2 vertebra, and so on and so forth through your lumbar and then your sacral nerves. There's 5 sacral nerves because remember the sacrum was 5 bones. So again, you have your 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and a coccygeal nerve. You'll also notice that at the level of about L1, L2, the spinal cord becomes the cauda equina, and these spinal nerves just kind of flare off of the spinal cord like that as you get down into the lower regions of the spinal cord. So let's look at how the spinal nerves come off the spinal cord. Here's your spinal cord with the white matter and the gray matter, and you'll see there's 2 roots. You have a dorsal root and a ventral root. And we've got these color-coded to let you know what's going on. The dorsal root is always sensory, and you can know if you're in the dorsal root by looking for this bulge called the dorsal root ganglion. So information always comes to the dorsal side, so your afferent information comes in, goes to the interneurons of the spinal cord, and then either can travel up and down to the brain, or if it's a reflex, which we'll talk about in just a second, the information will go out the ventral or motor route. So information is both coming in somatic sensory information and visceral sensory information. Then your output is both visceral motor and somatic motor. So remember, your visceral motor will be your autonomic. So that's that stuff that happens automatically. So information comes in the dorsal side, goes to the interneurons, and then out the ventral side. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is called a reflex. And a reflex, a spinal reflex, is a rapid and automatic motor response to a stimulus that does not involve the brain. So this is where something comes in, goes to the interneurons, the decision is made there, and then the output goes out the motor side. And so your integration or control center is the actual spinal cord and not the brain. And when you talk of reflexes, the effectors, the output is going to be the skeletal muscle. So your reflexes can be inborn, like intrinsic, which means you don't have to learn them. So like blinking, if someone comes at your eye, you automatically blink. Or learned, acquired, such as driving or playing the piano. And these reflexes only require your peripheral nerves and your spinal cord. So there's no upper cortex, cerebral cortex, or brain involvement with these reflexes. So when you're talking about a reflex, you've got 5 steps. You have a receptor, a sensory neuron, an integration neuron, a motor neuron, and an effector. And so this would be your receptor. So in the skin, let's imagine that the stimulus is something poking you, an ouch. And so the receptor would fire, and you would send the afferent signal through the dorsal root of the spinal cord, of the spinal nerve, into the spinal cord. That would send out with an interneuron, which is in the gray matter of the spinal cord. The decision would be made, integration. The decision would go back out, the efferent signal to the muscle and cause a contraction. So those are the 5 steps of a reflex arc: your receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, and effector. So imagine this as a test question, maybe an ordering question, or what comes next. So make sure you know the names of the 5 parts of the reflex and which order that they come in and what's going on during each step. Reflexes are important medically. We use these reflexes a lot of times to study how well the spinal cord is functioning, the spinal nerves and the spinal cord. And there's some very common reflexes listed in your book. I'm going to go over a few of these now, and I would like you to take a look at your book and read about some other reflexes as well. A common one is the flexor reflex, and this is withdrawal from a stimulus. So you imagine stepping on something sharp and you draw your foot back. That would be a flexor reflex. You can have a crossed extensor reflex, which is where you withdraw from a stimulus and extend the opposite limb. So it's kind of an opposite, pull one arm in and push one arm out, kind of a crossed extensor reflex. And then you have some superficial reflexes, such as the plantar and abdominal reflexes. So I'm going to talk about a few of these, but I also want you to spend some time looking in your book and learning about these a little more in detail. Now, why is it important to know reflexes? Again, if you've ever been to the doctor, they may have done a knee-jerk reflex. And this is to check to make sure your spinal cord and spinal nerves are intact and the reflex arc is intact. If someone has had a spinal cord injury, then this reflexes wouldn't work, and that gives you a good indication of where along the spinal cord you may have damage if certain reflexes are no longer functioning. This is just an example of how the knee-jerk reflex works. And you can read through. The very first step is you tap the tendon, the patellar ligament. And when you tap that patellar ligament, that stretches these muscle spindles in the quadriceps. And that sends your sensory information to your spinal cord. And the spinal cord is going to send out two signals at the same time. You're going to send out a signal to the quadriceps and to the hamstrings, okay? So your afferent signal, the blue one, travels to the spinal cord, all right? And then your efferent motor neurons, you send out one to the quadriceps and one to the hamstrings. Well, the quadriceps are going to contract and the hamstrings are going to relax, and that's going to allow your foot to jerk up. And that's called the knee jerk reflex. And that's just a really specific example of a reflex that they can test. If you've ever had this done at the office, they may tap on your elbow and on your knee. There's several places that they can do reflex testing. And again, it just gives you a good idea of whether or not your spinal cord and spinal nerves, if everything's working like they should be, that there's no damage or impinged nerves. If you had a herniated disc, it could be possible that the disc was herniated and bulged and causing there to be some impingement of that nerve, and possibly the reflex would not be as robust as it should be. There's also some reflexes that they do as a sign to see, especially in children and newborn babies. There's something called the plantar reflex, and the stimulus, if you stroke the bottom of the foot, your toes should kind of flex in. So if you kind of run a needle or a pin against the bottom of someone's foot, they should kind of curl their toes down. But in children, newborns, it's called the Babinski sign. When you do that, their toes kind of flare out. They don't curl in, they kind of flare out. It's called the fanning of the toes. And this is because infants don't have complete myelination. And so if it's the normal sign is for that to happen in children. But in an adult, if their toes flare out, then that's a sign of some kind of corticospinal damage. So Babinski sign of the toes fanning out is something you want to see in children, but not in adults. If you remember, we talked about developmental aspects of development with muscles and the nervous system. Your nervous system and muscles coordinate, they develop in a coordinated manner from top to bottom. And so the last thing you'd expect to really be fully intact would be the feet. And so again, they don't have that fully integrated reflex yet. So that's a normal sign, Babinski sign in children. So if you're going into labor and delivery, that's one of the things you'll do when you're looking at a child to make sure everything is normal and healthy. All right, that's the end of this talk, and I will see you later.